Greetings and welcome back to room 303 and our talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings now through the full deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass. We turn now to Song of Myself, passage number 34. Now let's just pause for a moment and say to ourselves, congratulations, you've made it. We have 19 sections remaining in Song of Myself. What did I say earlier when I said we were doing the 19 sections of starting from Paumanok? One of the things I said was, we're doing this reading so that we can do that reading. Well, we are now here at that reading, and so are you ready? You have the number of sections remaining in Song of Myself that you had when you began at section 1 of starting from Paumanok. Now, passage 34 is a fascinating passage. We just finished with that amazing, really long, 160 lines, amazing poem of 33. And you'll remember that we finished with some anguish, right? Again, gurgles the mouth of my dying general. He furiously waves with his hand. He gasps through the clot. Mind not me, mind the entrenchments. That's how we finished, right? And so now we're going to pick up with Whitman, the historian, and we're going to ask about this thing called cultural theodicy. If there is personal theodicy, why is it that bad things have to happen, the fifth of our big five, as we've said it before? Is there such a thing as cultural theodicy? Trying to explain, in other words, to a culture when terrible things happen, of course, maybe most importantly in war. Now, here we are in section 34, but we have said that sections 26 to 38 are this kind of attempt by Whitman to understand the poet's microscopic vision, moving from the ordinary to the mystical in some ways, we might say. And now in sections 34, 35, and 36, we're going to see Whitman's identification specifically with American history. And here we'll be working with a tragic moment in American history. We're going to be talking about the March 27th, 1836 surrender at Gilead, and then the slaughter of a good number of people. Captain Finian and his company of 371 Texans were captured, they surrendered, and then they were massacred and slaughtered. And we're gonna have to raise some disturbing questions about American history and about Whitman's view of American history, and we'll hopefully walk you through all of that. Now again, our key line from Song of Myself comes from the fourth part, where he says, both in and out of the game, and watching and wondering at it, I witness and wait. Now that witnessing is going to be the word that we'll underline from that quote as we take a look at this, because we've got this amazing kind of, we've seen this already a couple of times, but we're definitely going to see this ability of narrating a certain kind of event, historic event now, in poetic language. Now our assumption at learnstrong.net, down the left-hand side, Talks with Walt, is that you were with us for the 24 poems of inscriptions, the 19 sections of Paumanok, as we've already said, and the previous 33 sections of Song of Myself. Now, we're going to compare this slaughter, as he will call it, of 412 young men with passage 11 and those 20, you'll remember, the young boys or young men who are bathing, right? The 28 young men swimming, bathing, okay? And remember this line from passage 33, agonies are one of my changes of garments, end quote, right? Now, with the end of passage 33 and the beginning of 34 then, we're going to ask about Whitman's ability to narrate a story. He begins this way. These are, by the way, a new line to begin from the 55 edition. We'll talk about all of that. Now, I tell what I knew in Texas in my early youth. I tell not the fall of Alamo. Not one escaped to tell the fall of Alamo. The 150 are dumb yet at Alamo. 'Tis the tale of the murder in cold blood of 412 young men. Retreating, they had formed in a hollow square with their baggage for breastworks. 900 lives out of the surrounding enemies. 9 times their number was the price they took in advance. Their colonel was wounded, and their ammunition was gone. They treated for an honorable capitulation, received writing and seal, gave up their arms, and marched back, prisoners of war. They were the glory of the race of rangers, matchless with horse, rifle, song, supper, courtship, large, turbulent, generous, handsome, proud, and affectionate, bearded, sunburnt, dressed in the free costume of hunters, Not a single one over 30 years of age. The second first day morning, they were brought out in squads and massacred. It was beautiful early summer. The work commenced about 5 o'clock and was over by 8. None obeyed the command to kneel. Some made a mad and helpless rush. Some stood stark and straight. A few fell at once, shot in the temple or heart. The living and dead lay together. The maimed and mangled dug in the dirt. The newcomers saw them there. Some, half killed, attempted to crawl away. These were dispatched with bayonets or battered with the blunts of muskets. A youth, not 17 years old, seized his assassin till 2 more came to release him. The 3 were all torn and covered with the boy's blood. At 11 o'clock began the burning of the bodies. That is the tale of the murder of the 412 young men. Now, we've said about the echoes of Leaves of Grass, and again, that's why the deathbed edition for so many readers is more important than the 1855 edition, because you have the advantage of all of those poems and inscriptions, and then starting from Paumanok, before you even hit Song of Myself, and finally in passage 34, we get this amazing narrative. Whitman, as we've said, the 5 different Whitmans that we're looking at, go back and look at those intro lectures as we've given them. But we've said that Whitman as person is significant for us because he was a journalist. So he understood the eye of journalism. And he edited, actually, in some substantial ways, the 55 version of this. For example, removing certain kinds of articles and that type of thing to make the language very journalistic and punctual. Now we're going to ask about Whitman's tone, no question. Notice how he begins, and this again is a new line from the 55 edition. He says, "Now I tell what I knew." Who is the I? Is it Whitman? And how is it possible? Because Whitman, what could Whitman have known in Texas in my early youth? Now there is some really interesting history that's been done on how Whitman knew about this. And one answer is that Whitman read a journal entry by an actual Mexican soldier who was there and actually watched specifically what transcended. And this officer witnessed what happened and wrote about it in his journals, and then Whitman reads it in his journals, and then he writes about it. So just think about how powerful that is. So you have somebody who was joined in some ways in the slaughter, writes about it, and then Whitman turns around and will discuss it through poetry. It's quite a remarkable thing. He says, "Now I'll tell you what I knew in Texas in my early youth." Of course, youth is going to be significant here. It takes us back again to passage 11 and those 28 youth that are swimming. Then in the parentheses, he says, "I tell not the fall of the Alamo." By the way, the fall of the Alamo was ended 6 March 1836, and then just, a few days later, some 20 days later roughly, we'll have the experience here as it's told at Goliad. He says, "Not one escaped to tell the fall of Alamo. The 150 are dumb yet at Alamo." By the way, notice the way he uses the word dumb throughout Leaves of Grass. And then we've got an interesting line that was in the 55 edition that's actually 2 times used in the 55 edition that we have edited out. And it runs like this: "Hear now the tale of a jet black sunrise." And he'll end actually this poem with that as well. Jet black sunrise. It's interesting why he would decide to remove this. We're going to ask about his journalistic voice when we get to the end here. Notice the narrative begins. Retreating, they had formed in a hollow. And again, this is that amazing thing that Whitman loves to do, where he'll say a hollow square with their baggage for breastworks, and we think about that fissure of the cliff at the end of passage 31. Go back and look at that. 900 lives out of the surrounding enemies, 9 times their number was the price they took in advance. So in other words, these men had been engaged in conflict and in war. Their colonel was wounded, their ammunition gone. They treated for an honorable capitulation, in other words, surrender, okay? Received writing, by the way, the elided use of the word, of the spelling received to give us that American vernacular, as we've said many times. Writing and seal, in other words, there was a promise given that these men would be treated correctly. So they gave up their arms, which is going to be, of course, a point of contention, right, as one will understand American history, and marched back prisoners of war. Notice the stanzas here as they will take a certain perspective, right? So the first part is, let me tell you about what happened. Well, what happened is some warriors, some soldiers were engaged in war, surrounded, and then they gave up, right? They capitulated, and in the process of doing so, they were promised that they would be treated correctly, right? And so they gave up their arms. Now, who were they? Sounding very much like Tennyson's voice in Charge of the Light Brigade. You'll remember that one from 1854, just a year before 55. We've given full lecture on that one at learnstrong.net. They were the glory of the race of Rangers. Now, of course, this use of the use of the word Rangers has a powerful American history as well, right? And then we've got 5 things said about them in one line, 6 things said about them in the next line, which taken collectively to the third line says a whole lot about them, and says a lot about Whitman as well. Matchless, unparalleled, with horse, rifle, song, supper, courtship. Now, the first 3, horse, rifle, the first 2, horse and rifle, that makes sense. They're soldiers, right? But the next one, song, will immediately make us think about the very poem we're reading, Song of Myself. And then supper, what's that about? In other words, they enjoyed life? Is that what we're saying? And then the last one in this line is even more remarkable, courtship, right? In other words, they were, Whitman's trying to point out, they were young men who were just like any other young man. Then look at the next one. We're told they're large, they're turbulent, that's an interesting adjective. Now, instead of brave, which was used in 55, he just continues. They're generous, handsome, proud, and, to borrow from courtship from the earlier line, affectionate. So you got 5, 6 taken collectively. 11 things about these. And notice from the 55, where all of these are constructed with conjunctions like and, here notice it's just the comma. It punctuates exactly who and what they were. Finally, we're told they're bearded, which, by the way, is fascinating because we're going to be messing around with hair, I said, just like in Milton's Paradise Lost as we were studying that together, in passage 5, in passage 6, and then, of course, the 28 young men in passage 11. Go back and look at the way bearded there, here bearded, that echoing is powerful. Bearded, sunburned, and then dressed in the free costume of hunters, right? That is to say, from especially the Tennessee region. Not a single one over 30 years of age, just to prove his point that these were very young men. Then we have another break. And now we're going to get back to the actual narrative itself. The second first day morning. By the way, in 55, it was actually just Sunday. Using his kind of Quaker parlance, right? Remember, he comes from that Elias Hicks extreme Quakerism. That's what he's raised in, even though he probably didn't adopt much of that in his adulthood. But remember, Quakers are pacifists, and so it's going to be significant that we read this through the lens of that. The second first day morning, they were brought out in squads, and then he just says it directly, and massacred. Okay? Notice he doesn't beat around the bush here. The verb is, the word massacred is an important word for us. And then, bizarrely, sounding like maybe Crane's Great Badge of Courage and Crane's naturalism, it was beautiful early summer. What an amazing line to throw in. In other words, again, it's this perspective that Whitman, the poet, wants to have. As he says, let me tell you something I'm watching, and you will be able to watch it through me. It's a compelling way to tell a story. And he says, oh yeah, it was really beautiful outside. As all these guys get seriously jacked. Notice he continues. The work, that's what he calls it. And I'm sorry, I can't help but read this, the work, and not think about Conrad's Heart of Darkness and the tragic grove scene. The work was commencing. The work, we've given lectures on this at learnstrong.net. The work commenced about 5 o'clock and was over by 8. So there you go, in 3 hours it's all done. None, and now a new stanza. Now we're going to begin to hear the truly patriotic Whitman voice, right? In other words, these were young men worthy of our respect. Notice, none obeyed the command to kneel. There we are, of course, at the Declaration of Independence. Don't tell me what to do. We've said many times as the mantra of what it means to understand American history. Don't tell me what to do. No, no, no. You don't tell me, I tell you. Here, notice, none obeyed the command to kneel. Some made a mad, interesting the use of that word, right, and helpless rush. Some stood stark, and here we are back to standing again. Notice how many times the word standing comes up in Leaves of Grass. Stood stark and straight. In other words, they died with honor, right? A few fell at once, and then it's for 1855 especially, it's a pretty grotesque kind of representation of what happens. Of course, later, after 55, at the beginning of the American Civil War and afterwards, readers will read these lines with all of that as background. Shot in the Templar heart, the living and the dead laid together, the unity, the democracy of death, right? The maimed and mangled dug in the dirt. It's a great eye, right? They're scratching in the dirt. And of course, think about how dirt keeps coming back again and again and again in Leaves of Grass. The newcomers saw them there. Maybe the newcomers are one of these Mexican officers that write about it in their journals that Whitman possibly read. Some have killed, attempted to crawl away. The imagery is profound. And then he says, these were dispatched, from work to dispatched, with bayonets or battered, again, notice your alighted verbs, with the blunts of muskets. So it's grotesque the way these young men are slaughtered. A youth, and now, notice, he goes from the large number to a single one. This is, again, that focusing of the prism that we're commenting on in all of these sections. A youth, not 17 years old, seized his assassin. It's interesting that he would use the word assassin. It would become, of course, the word of all words after the assassination of Lincoln. His assassin, till two more came to release him. The three were all torn and covered with the boy's blood. Many readers of 55 would have, of course, enjoyed the fact that Whitman points out that a young 17-year-old American kid's going to go down struggling against three, and the other three will have blood all over him of the kid as the kid goes down, right? And then there's the break of the stanza, and we're going to realize now that we've gone from 5 to 11. So in 6 hours all this is done. At 11 o'clock began the burning of the bodies. Now, the moment that we hear this, we immediately have to think about, and guys, this is why we read the classics as we pick up a text like Whitman's Leaves of Grass to try and read it. We read our Iliad. We read our Aeneid, especially to understand what's being referenced here or alluded to. How does the Iliad end? Well, of course, with the burning of the body of Patroclus, and of course the return of the corpse of Hector back to King Priam, right? That's how it ends. Thus they buried the body of Hector, the great lion, the great horse tamer. I've given full lectures on that, but think about how the Iliad ends with honorable death and burial. Here, it is dishonorable, and so clearly Whitman's playing that game. At 11 o'clock began the burning of the bodies, and then he's done. That is the tale. It's interesting he would use that word, tale, of the murder of the 412 young men. The 55 edition of this poem, by the way, didn't end there. It ends with the line, and that was a jet black sunrise. It's an interesting way for the poem to finish. And again, we have to ask, why edit lines like this? Well, obviously at 2A, war is hell, no question. No question, the argument could be made, America was built by heroes. Whitman, however, said this in his journals later about the Mexican War and what he called the Spanish element in our nationality, just to prove Whitman's understanding of the importance of the Mexican Spanish element in our nationality. He said, quote, "To that composite American identity of the future, Spanish character will supply some of the most needed parts. No stock shows a grander historic retrospect, grander in religiousness and loyalty, or for patriotism, courage, decorum, gravity, and honor, as to the Spanish stock of our Southwest. It is certain that we do not begin to appreciate the splendor and sterling value of its race element. Who knows but that element, like the course of some subterranean river, dripping invisibly for 100 or 2 years, is now to emerge in broadest flow and permanent action." Proof that Whitman had great admiration for the Spanish element, as he would call it. We think of Thoreau, 3A, we think of Thoreau's civil disobedience, and of course Tennyson's charge of the Light Brigade, as we've said. Final question for you to own this poem. Can you believe that there is progress and conflict resolution without war. What are your thoughts on that as we work with a passage like this? And now let's move on to passage 35 and another important historical moment. Thank you.